Did you know a commercial airliner can become a giant glider mid-flight? I didn't believe it until the night I lost all 4 engines of my Boeing 747 at 36,000 feet, with 267 people trusting me. What started as a routine flight over the Indian Ocean turned into the most surreal nightmare of my career. 27 minutes of absolute silence, falling 600 feet per minute, while a strange mist transformed my aircraft into something I no longer recognized. My name's Jack, I'm 41 years old, and I'd been flying commercial aircraft for nearly 2 decades when that night happened. I already had over 15,000 flight hours under my belt, most of them in heavy jets. I knew every sound, every vibration, every quirk of the 747 like it was an extension of my own body. It was June, and we were flying a transoceanic route that would take me back home after a layover in Southeast Asia. The crew was exceptional. Mike, my first officer, had 10 years of experience and was meticulous down to the last detail. Steve, our flight engineer, knew that 747 better than anyone. He'd literally grown up with that model. We had 15 flight attendants taking care of the 247 passengers filling the cabin that night. Families returning from vacation, business executives on work trips, a newlywed couple on their honeymoon, regular people trusting their lives to us. The flight had been absolutely normal up to that point. We'd departed on time, the climb was smooth, and we'd been at cruise altitude for several hours. It was around 11 at night when we were crossing over the Indian Ocean. Most passengers were sleeping, the cabin lights were dimmed, and the meal service had already been completed. In the flight deck, we maintained that hypnotic routine that characterizes long nighttime flights. Periodic instrument checks, sporadic communications with control, the constant drone of the engines as background music. I remember we were talking about weekend plans. Mike was going on about his son's birthday when I noticed something strange out the window. A diffuse glow, kind of greenish, dancing across the wings. At first I figured my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but then Mike saw it too. "Jack, you seeing this?" he asked, leaning forward. "I'm seeing it," I replied, trying to process what my eyes were picking up. It looked like St. Elmo's fire, that electrical phenomenon that sometimes appears in thunderstorms. But there wasn't any storm. The sky was clear, not a cloud on the weather radar. The glow got more intense. Electric blue, pulsing, spreading across the wings, like the plane was catching fire with frozen flames. It was mesmerizing and terrifying at the same time. Steve, the flight engineer, got up from his seat to get a better view, and I saw the reflection of those blue lights dancing across his pale face. "This ain't normal," he muttered, and for the first time in years of flying together, I heard a tremor in his voice. That's when the smoke started coming into the cockpit. At first it was just a smell, acrid, suffocating, like sulfur mixed with something burning. Then we saw the white mist starting to form, thin at first, but rapidly getting denser. My heart raced. Smoke in the cockpit is one of any pilot's worst nightmares. It means fire, and fire at cruise altitude can be catastrophic. "Oxygen masks!" I shouted, and all 3 of us grabbed our masks simultaneously. My fingers were shaking as I adjusted the straps. Through the mask, my voice came out muffled and metallic when I hit the intercom. "Cabin crew, Captain here. We have an emergency. Prepare for possible emergency descent." Mike was already in the emergency protocols, running through the fire-in-flight checklist. Steve monitored all the systems, his eyes jumping from gauge to gauge on his engineer's panel. Engine temperature indicators were normal, no fire warnings, but the smoke kept increasing, and that horrible smell permeated everything. "Control, this is..." I started transmitting our emergency, but before I could finish, I felt it. A subtle change in sound. Engine number 4, the outermost on the right wing, changed its tone. It wasn't a loud or dramatic noise, it was just different, an almost imperceptible variation that my trained ears caught instantly. "Engine 4 showing..." Steve started but didn't finish the sentence. His eyes widened as he saw the indicators. "Engine 4 failed. We lost engine 4. My stomach clenched, but I kept my voice steady. "Confirm engine 4 shut down. Begin engine out procedure." Losing one engine isn't the end of the world on a 747. The aircraft was designed to fly on 3, 2, even 1 engine if necessary. I'd trained for this dozens of times in the simulator, but in that thick smoke, with those alien blue lights dancing on the wings. Something in the back of my mind screamed that this was just the beginning. 30 seconds later, Engine 2 started sputtering. "No, no, no," Steve whispered, his hands flying over the controls, desperately trying to stabilize it. But it was useless. With a mechanical sigh that sounded obscenely loud in that moment of tension, Engine 2 died. 2 engines lost, on the left side now. The plane started banking slightly. I corrected with the controls, but I could feel the aircraft getting heavier, less responsive. 267 people behind me. 267 lives. 15 crew members. My crew, my responsibility. Jakarta Control, we're declaring an emergency. We've lost 2 engines. Need immediate vector to nearest airport. Mike transmitted with controlled urgency. The controller's response came choppy through static. Roger, vector to altitude. I couldn't hear the rest. Because at that moment, Engine 1 failed. The sound is something I'll never forget. It wasn't an explosion, it wasn't a bang, it was silence. The sudden disappearance of that constant hum, that's the soundtrack of every flight. Engine 1 on the left side just stopped. And I knew with an ice-cold certainty that ran down my spine that Engine 3 would be next. "Jack," Mike looked at me and I saw my own terror reflected in his eyes. "Jack, we can't lose number 4. But we did. 20 seconds later, the last engine, number 3, gave its last gasp. And then, silence. Absolute silence. You ever heard a 747 without engines? There's no sound in the world like it. The wind whistling through the control surfaces, the occasional creak of the structure, little electronic beeps from the instruments, but that powerful roar, that constant vibration you feel in your bones throughout the entire flight, gone. I was flying a 180-ton glider at 36,000 feet with 267 people on board, over the ocean. "Ladies and gentlemen," my voice came out surprisingly calm on the PA, "this is the captain. We're experiencing a technical difficulty with the engines. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow the instructions of the cabin crew." Technical difficulty. What an absurd euphemism. We were falling out of the sky. Steve was working frantically trying to restart the engines. In-flight restart procedure over and over again. Nothing. The engines were dead. But the instruments showed the turbines were still windmilling. They weren't seized. So why wouldn't they restart? "Rate of descent 600 feet per minute," Mike announced, his voice tight. "Altitude 35,400 feet. I did quick calculations in my head. At that rate of descent, we had about 50 minutes until sea level. 50 minutes to figure out what was happening, restart at least one engine or find a place to land. A place to land a 747 without engines, in the middle of the ocean, at night. The smoke in the cockpit was so thick now we could barely see the instruments. My eyes burned even with the oxygen mask. We needed to descend to denser air, where we might have more lift, more time. "Initiating emergency descent," I announced. I pushed the yoke forward, increasing the descent angle. We needed the delicate balance, descend fast enough to get out of that smoke layer or whatever it was, but not so fast we'd lose lift completely and go into a spin. Through the cockpit's rearview mirrors I could see sparks shooting from the engines. Little explosions of white light, like silent fireworks in the darkness. The windscreen was starting to get opaque, scratched, like it was being sandblasted. "Captain," the lead flight attendant's voice came over the intercom, and I could hear the barely contained panic. "The passengers are smelling smoke. They know something's wrong. What do I tell them?" What would she tell them? That we were without engines, that we were falling in a giant glider, that I had no clue what was causing this? "Tell them we're handling the situation and they need to stay calm," I replied. "Prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Brace position." There was a long pause, then in a low voice, "Roger, Captain. 30,000 feet, 29,000, 28,000. The altimeter unwound relentlessly. The ocean down below was absolute darkness. No ship lights, no city lights, just the black void waiting for us. Mike was on the radio, desperately trying to contact anyone. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday! This is—" Static. Interference. No clear response. Steve was trying for the 10th, 11th time to restart the engines. Nothing. "Why won't they light?" he yelled, frustration finally cracking his professional composure. "The turbines are turning. We've got fuel. Why won't they light?" 23,000 feet. 21,000. That's when I noticed something changing. The smoke. Was it starting to clear? The windscreen was still scratched and opaque, but I could see better now. The blue lights on the wings had disappeared. We were coming out of it, whatever it was. Altitude 20,000 feet, Mike announced. Rate of descent still at 600 per minute. Steve, try again, I ordered. Engine 4 first. I heard the click of the igniter. Once, twice, 3 times. And then, like a miracle, I heard the most beautiful sound of my life, the whine of a jet turbine coming to life. Engine 4 caught. The sensation of power returning, that familiar vibration was like pure oxygen after drowning. Engine 4 restarted, Steve yelled, and for the first time in 15 hellish minutes, there was hope in his voice. Engine 3! Try 3! I nearly shouted. More clicks, more attempts. And then... Yes! Engine 3 roared back to life. Tears were streaming down my face inside the oxygen mask. I hadn't realized I was crying. 2 engines, we had 2 engines. We weren't falling anymore. We were flying again. But our ordeal wasn't over yet. We were at 18,000 feet, way below cruise altitude, with only 2 of 4 engines running over the ocean at night, with semi-opaque windscreens that made visibility practically nil, and we still had no idea what had happened. Jakarta Control, can you hear me? Mike transmitted, his voice hoarse from tension. We managed to restart 2 engines. Need immediate vector to nearest airport. Windscreens damaged, visibility severely compromised. This time, the response came clear. Roger that. Vector heading 090, nearest airport 170 miles. You're cleared for any altitude. Emergency services being alerted. I turned the aircraft to the new heading. Every movement on the controls had to be smooth, calculated. With only 2 engines, we had no margin for error. The power asymmetry needed constant compensation. It was like driving a car with only 2 wheels working. Possible, but demanding total concentration. Steve, status on engines 1 and 2, I asked. No indication of structural damage, he replied, his eyes still fixed on the panels. But they're not responding to restart attempts either. It's like they're clogged. Clogged. The word echoed in my mind. Clogged with what? But there was no time for theories now. We needed to land this airplane. Mike, ask the controllers for airport conditions. We need to know runway length if they've got working ILS, anything that'll help because we're landing practically blind. The response came in pieces. 10,000-foot runway, ILS operational on the main runway, calm winds, clear skies. At least we had that going for us. But landing a 747 partially blind, with half the engines, was still something none of us had done outside the simulator. And we hadn't even practiced something like this in the simulator. 10,000 feet altitude. We started the approach checklist, each item verified meticulously despite the urgency. Landing gear, test flaps, verify movement. Hydraulic systems, check pressure. Everything seemed to be working, miraculously intact beyond the dead engines and damaged windscreen. Attention, ladies and gentlemen, I spoke on the PA, forcing my voice to sound confident. We've managed to restart 2 engines, and we're making our approach for landing in a few minutes. The crew will instruct you in the emergency position. Follow exactly what they tell you. We're going to land safely. Are we? The doubt sliced through my mind like a blade. I pushed the thought away. Had to believe it. Had to make it happen. 5,000 feet. We could see lights now. The city, the airport. The illuminated runway was a line of hope cutting through the darkness. But through the damaged windscreen, everything was blurred, distorted. It was like trying to read through frosted glass. I'm going to have to land looking out the side window, I told Mike and Steve. You guys are going to be my eyes. Tell me everything. Height, alignment, approach speed. Mike nodded, his face serious but focused. We've got you, Jack. 2,600 feet. 2,000. We were on final approach. My right hand on the yoke, left hand on the thrust levers of the 2 working engines. Every fiber of my being concentrated on that moment. 1,000 feet, Mike called out. Speed's good. Alignment slightly right. Correction 2 degrees left, I corrected gently. The plane responded, heavy but controllable. 600 feet. 300. 150. I could see the ground now through the side window. The approach lights passing, the runway asphalt coming up. 150, 40, 30, 20, 10. I pulled back on the yoke, flaring. I felt the gentle touch of the main wheels on the ground. A second touch, firmer. We were down. I engaged the reversers on the two working engines, pressing hard on the brakes. The airplane decelerated. 3,000 feet of runway, 2,500, 1,500, 600. We stopped with 300 feet to spare. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. We just breathed, the harsh sound of our exhalations inside the oxygen masks filling the silence. Then I heard it, coming from the passenger cabin. Applause, shouts of joy, crying from relief. We were alive, all of us. 267 passengers, 15 crew members. Every single soul on board was alive. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to Black Box and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next incredible tales from the skies. Conclusion: 13,251 characters. The hours that followed were a blur. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft, but there was no need, no fire, no serious injuries, beyond a few cases of hyperventilation and anxiety among the passengers. We evacuated everyone through the normal stairs, not the emergency exits. Families hugged in the terminal. People cried with relief. One man came up to me and just hugged me, not saying a word, tears streaming down his face. While passengers were being taken to the terminal, engineers and technicians were already starting to examine the plane. It was one of them who discovered the first clue. He ran his finger across the damaged windscreen and then showed me. A grey substance, fine as powder, covered the entire surface. He rubbed it between his fingers and smelled it. "Volcanic ash," he said, his eyes widening. "You guys flew through a volcanic ash cloud?" The explanation emerged gradually in the hours that followed. A volcano in Indonesia had erupted days earlier, launching millions of tons of ash into the stratosphere. The ash clouds were invisible to our weather radars. They simply didn't show up, and we'd flown straight through them at 36,000 feet. The microscopic ash was sucked into the engines. In the high-temperature combustion, it melted, turning into liquid glass that coated the turbine blades, the sensors, everything. That's why the engines failed one by one. They were literally being clogged with molten glass. The blue glow on the wings, static electricity generated by the ash particles, the smoke in the cockpit, fine ash being sucked in through the ventilation system. The opaque windscreen, sandblasting by millions of abrasive particles. And why did the engines come back to life when we descended? Simple. At lower altitude, the external temperature is higher, but the temperature inside the non-running engines decreased. The molten glass cooled, breaking into pieces that were expelled when we tried to restart. It was pure luck. If we'd waited longer, the glass would have solidified permanently, and the engines never would have run again. Later inspections revealed extensive damage. All 4 engines needed to be replaced. The front windscreen was so damaged it had to be changed. There was ash in the tiniest cracks of the airplane, but the structure was intact, and everyone was alive. In the days that followed, I had time to process what happened. I called my wife as soon as we got to the hotel, and when I heard her voice, I fell apart. I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. She listened to everything, every detail, every second of those 27 minutes of terror. "You saved 267 people," she said when I finished. "You brought everyone home." But I hadn't saved anyone alone. It was Mike maintaining communications, staying calm when I could feel his terror. It was Steve tirelessly trying to restart the engines, never giving up. It was the cabin crew keeping nearly 300 people calm when they could smell smoke and knew something was terribly wrong. It was every team member doing their job perfectly under unimaginable pressure. And it was training. Years and years of training for emergencies you hope never to face. Simulators teaching procedures until they become reflexes. Checklists memorized. Protocols followed. It wasn't heroism, it was professionalism. I went back home 3 days later. I hugged my wife for long minutes at the airport. I played with my kids in the yard, feeling the grass under my feet, the sun on my face. Simple things I almost lost forever that night over the ocean. The airline offered psychological support for the entire crew. I went to the sessions, reluctantly at first, but they helped. Processing the trauma, understanding it was okay to feel fear retrospectively, that nightmares were normal. It took months before I could sleep through the night without waking up in panic, smelling sulfur. Mike took a 6-month leave before returning to flying. Steve moved to groundwork, training new flight engineers. I didn't judge him. Everyone processes trauma differently. As for me, I returned to the skies 3 months later. I needed to. Flying wasn't just my profession, it was part of who I was. I couldn't let that night take that away from me. The first flight back was the hardest. Climbing through the clouds, every bump made me tense up. But the co-pilot beside me, a veteran who knew my story, simply said, "You've already faced the worst, everything else is a piece of cake." And he was right. That incident changed aviation. Protocols were established for volcanic ash detection. Routes are altered when there's volcanic activity. Monitoring systems were improved, but nothing's perfect. Nature will always surprise us with something we didn't anticipate, something we didn't train for, something that challenges all our technology and knowledge. And that's where the human factor comes in. The ability to improvise, to think under pressure, not to panic when everything's going wrong. It's not the engines that save lives, it's the people operating them. I received some commendations after the incident. Nice ceremonies, speeches about courage and competence. But the thing I treasure most isn't any medal. It's a letter I received 2 months after the incident. It was from an 8-year-old girl who was on the flight with her parents. She'd drawn an airplane, a 747 with 4 engines, all with red flames coming out. She'd heard the adults talking about the firelights on the wings. And underneath, in careful, childish handwriting, she wrote, "Thank you for taking me home, Captain Jack. When I grow up, I want to be a pilot just like you." That letter is framed in my office to this day because it reminds me why we do what we do. It's not for the thrill of flying or the glamour of the profession. It's for the 267 people who put their lives in our hands every time they board. It's for the responsibility of bringing every soul on board safely home. I learned a lot of lessons that night. I learned that nature is powerful and merciless, and that our technology, no matter how advanced, has limits. I learned that training is worth its weight in gold, that doing the right thing at the right time can mean the difference between life and death. I learned that teamwork isn't just a nice phrase, but the only way to survive when everything falls apart. But above all, I learned about control. Not control over the airplane or the situation. Sometimes those things are beyond our reach. But control over yourself, over your fear, over your voice when it needs to sound calm to 267 people who are terrified, over your hands when they want to shake, but need to stay steady on the controls, over your mind when it wants to panic, but needs to keep thinking, calculating, deciding. Control isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. Today, 15 years later, I still fly. I don't pilot 747s anymore. Age and regulations moved me to different routes, different aircraft. But every flight, every takeoff, I carry with me the lessons from that night. I check volcanic activity reports obsessively. I pay extra attention to route monitoring systems, and I never ever underestimate what nature can throw our way. I run into some of those passengers occasionally. Aviation's a small world. Some recognize me, come talk to me, share how that night changed them. One of them became a pilot inspired by the incident. Another develops volcanic ash detection systems. They all carry that experience in different ways, but they all share one thing, a deep appreciation for how fragile and precious life is. If this story touched you, consider subscribing to Black Box. We've got many other incredible aviation tales waiting for you. Sometimes on clear nights, I look up at the sky and see airplane lights passing, little moving dots against the blanket of stars. And I think about the people inside those planes, families going to visit relatives, couples on honeymoons, business executives on work trips, each one with their stories, their dreams, their precious lives. And I think about the pilots up front, in the flight deck, doing routine checks, talking about mundane stuff, confident in their technology, their training, their experience, not knowing that maybe that very night they might be tested in ways they never imagined, that they might have to make decisions they'll carry for the rest of their lives. But I also think about something else, that if that moment comes, they'll be ready. Because we're prepared for the impossible, trained for the unimaginable, ready to do whatever's necessary to bring every soul on board back home. That's what we do. That's who we are. And that night over the Indian Ocean, When I lost all my engines and fell from the sky with 267 lives depending on me, I did what every pilot is trained to do, stayed calm, followed the procedures, worked with my team, and never, ever gave up. Because giving up wasn't an option, not when 267 people trusted me with their lives. And I brought everyone home. Ever stopped to think how many times you've flown without knowing that, just a few miles away, there could be an invisible volcanic ash cloud waiting? How many times pilots diverted from dangers that passengers never knew existed? The sky might look empty and safe, but it's full of invisible challenges. And the only thing between you and those dangers are two trained pilots in the flight deck, ready for the impossible. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Black Box and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next tale from the skies. Share this video with anyone who loves aviation stories and tell me in the comments, would you fly knowing these risks exist?